Welcome to this episode of League of Nations, where we'll be looking at the Great Depression and how it affected the League itself. So, how did the Great Depression make the League's work far more difficult? Now, for us to look into this matter, we need to bear in mind the aims of the League. So, just to do a quick recap, the aims of the League is to uphold the Treaty of Versailles, to maintain peace, to discourage aggressive behavior, to improve living and working conditions, and to encourage international cooperation and international trade. So it's all about working together. So how did the Great Depression make this aim untenable, unachievable? So we have to look at it from that perspective. So let's look at what the Great Depression had done to certain countries, for example, Germany and Italy. So let's look at what the Great Depression did towards Germany and towards Italy. What did it do? Basically, it brought about the rise of extreme right-wing nationalists. In Germany, you had a person like Hitler. In Italy, you had a person like Mussolini. The rise of these extremist nationalist leaders, they came into power through the support of the people who lost their job. They lost faith in democracy. They have put their hopes in democracy, in capitalism, and the whole thing basically caved in due to the Great Depression. Banks in America were calling back their loans. Trade was not going well. International trade was breaking down with tariff wars. And so it turned out to be a disaster in a way. And so what do these people do? They need to look for hope. And where do they get their hope from? They turn to extreme parties such as the Nazis, who promised solutions to the economic crisis. You see, these people are smart. They knew what the people wanted. Because of the Great Depression, there was no work. And because there is no work, you don't get paid. And because you don't get paid, you cannot buy daily provisions, bread, food, items. And so what happened is that the people demanded for work and bread. Now, the Weimar government at the time was not able to support this in Germany, and hence Hitler took advantage of this. What did he do? He promised the people that if you vote the Nazis, he will ensure, he and his party would ensure that the people would be employed, they would have work, and because they would have work, they would have bread as well. So this is something the people were hoping for. Now, one thing about these extremist nationalist leaders like Hitler and Mussolini, they are not a big fan of democracy. They do not believe in democracy, but rather in totalitarianism and fascism. They ignore the League's authority and they pursue their own objective, which is militarism. Now, when Hitler in 1933 came to power, he quietly, silently, more like covertly, got his army to rearm themselves, but on the sidelines, basically, so that the League of Nations wouldn't know what Germany was up to. So what did the Nazis do? They built up their armed forces and used aggression to achieve their domestic and foreign policy aim. So how did the Great Depression make the League's work more difficult? The rise of extreme right-wing nationalists. Now we move on to the next point. And in our next point, we'll be looking at new markets. Now in the Great Depression, remember, prior to the Great Depression, countries were trading with each other. So Japan, for example, was producing silk, and their silk was sold overseas. And there was a demand for their silk, but because of the Great Depression, such a demand evaporated, and hence Japan could not sell their silk overseas. And so this caused them tremendous pressure to find new resources and markets. Now, countries such as Japan and Italy found themselves in this situation. they had to find new markets and raw materials. The finding of new markets and raw material can only be achieved through colonization or annexation. For example, Japan in Manchuria. Okay, so they were targeting Manchuria because of new markets and raw materials. Now, to fulfill this, to get Manchuria, for example, and for Italy, they were aiming towards Abyssinia. To fulfill this, countries have to act aggressively, and this is likely to involve war because nobody's going to give you the red carpet and welcome to my country, take whatever you want. There'll be resistance, and when there's resistance, there's likely to take people to take up arms, and this would involve war. This is where the League of Nations should step in because one of their aims was to discourage aggressive behavior and to maintain peace. They had to use their powers. And what is their powers? Moral condemnation. And if that didn't work, they'll have to use economic sanction. And if that also didn't work, then they'll need to use force. They'll have to use force in order to maintain the peace. And in doing so, the League must be committed to this. However, when we look at countries like Japan and Italy, remember, these countries do not care much about the authority of the League, and their focus is not on internationalism, but rather on domestic needs. Hence, the pressure to find new resources and markets grew every day, and the people were getting restless. Now, remember, Japan, basically their population was increasing, so the demand for new resources and markets was increasing. And the Great Depression made this even more so, hence making the League's work far more difficult. Another reason we can go through would be the focus of the League members themselves. So we were talking in the last two slides about the aggressive nations. Now let's look at the League members themselves. Now remember, the League of Nations had over 40 nations in it, but the real pillars or the real countries that have true and powerful influence in the League was Britain and France. Now during the Great Depression, member countries were focusing on their own domestic issues. Britain and France were doing the same thing. They were focusing on their own issues. They had their own problems. And one thing about Britain, basically, was that they were very concerned about their empire, the stability of their empire, due to this Great Depression. Hence, they were focusing a lot on their domestic issues, the challenges they were facing, including unemployment, rather than taking an interest in ensuring the League's aims. So the League's aims, which is UMDI, upholding the Treaty of Versailles, maintaining the peace, discouraging aggressive behaviors of nations, member nations, improving living and working conditions, as well as encouraging international trade and international cooperation. These aims were not met because member countries were focusing not on international issues, but rather on domestic issues. So that was another hindrance for the League. So how did the Great Depression make the League's work more difficult? It forced the League members to shift their focus from internationalism to domestic issues and challenges, hence ignoring the League's aim altogether. Now, the next point that I'd like to focus on would be lack of armament funding. Now, remember, during the Great Depression, economy had collapsed and basically funds were running dry, and hence governments will need to ration their resources really carefully. Now, since the nation's wealth was eroded during the Great Depression, massive cuts were made in funding armaments as limited funds were channeled for social needs rather than military needs. So just imagine you have a pie and 100% was supposed to go to military, but now you're going to cut it down and give more towards social. So let's say 50-50. but make it lesser for the military because more funds will be needed for social needs. Now, remember the Great Depression, a lot of people were unemployed. Social benefits are being questioned right now. People need social benefits during the Great Depression. So the government have limited resources, limited wealth. Hence, they need to fund more towards the social needs. They need to meet the needs of the people rather than military needs. As a result of this, the League members lack the means to deal with aggressive countries. For example, like Germany and Italy. Now, Germany, to give you an example, in Germany during the Great Depression, what Germany did to the factories was to convert commercial factories into military factories. So you employ people to join the factories and to work and produce arms. Whereas in capitalist countries like Britain, there's a great need to invest and to make sure that the domestic economy was vibrant. So there's a lot of economic stimulus that was pumped into it. And therefore, military took a back seat. And because of that, the League members, like Britain, didn't have the military resources or the military strength to face off with Germany, who was strengthening their armaments, basically. Their arms was increasing, and basically what Hitler was doing in Germany, breaking the Treaty of Versailles. Because remember, the Treaty of Versailles, they cannot rearm themselves. Germany could not do that. But here you have Germany doing exactly that, although in 1933, when Hitler came to power, they were doing it covertly. Okay? It wasn't broadcasted to everyone until 1935. Okay, so lack of armament was another reason why the League's work was made difficult. They didn't have enough armament to face off with aggressive countries. Now, why was there lack of armament? Because of funding allocation. More money was given towards social needs, less money towards military needs. And why was that? Because of the Great Depression. Okay, moving on to economic and trading priority. Let's look at the League's, the members of the League. What was their priority? Now remember, we just went through the slides earlier, social needs, economic needs. They were focusing on revamping, revitalizing their economy. So they could not afford to close down mines. They could not afford to close down any trading opportunity, or close off any trading opportunities with other countries. And this includes aggressive nations such as Japan. Okay, so priority was given in ensuring economic sustainability through international trading. So they tried to still maintain international trading, although there was this thing called the tariff wars at the time, but still there was importance given to maintaining or ensuring economic sustainability. Now, let's focus a bit on this first point. Priority was given in ensuring economic stability, sustainability through international trading. What does this mean, basically? The League of Nations, their members, basically put a lot of emphasis in maintaining sustainability of the economy. That means it's still growing, it still needs to run its course because it's going to affect employment rate in their country. So they still have to trade. And to do this, they need good relations with overseas countries. Like even with aggressive countries like Japan, they still need to have that. So member countries were not very keen on implementing the second power of the League, which is economic sanction. Now, at the time of the Great Depression, we're going to the second point here. At the time of the Great Depression in the 1930s, member countries were reluctant to impose economic sanction against aggressive nations. So when Japan invaded Manchuria in the Manchurian crisis, that led to the Manchurian crisis, the League of Nations were very slow and very reluctant to take any action against, any concrete action against Japan. because they were afraid that by doing so, it's going to affect the international trade, and they cannot afford to have any setbacks in terms of trading. So member countries wanted to maintain existing trade contacts even with the aggressors. Thus, the League's aim of discouraging aggressive behavior took a backseat.